Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. We are in a phase of history that I never thought I'd want to go through. I would call it de-democratization. We're losing democracy right, left, and center, and it scares the daylights out of me. And matter of fact, I'm not even happy with some of the democracy that we have. I'm worried about even the good ones. So today we're going to have a conversation I think will probably center on that very worry that a lot of us share. I have two friends with me. This is Schmooze Day. So the thing I enjoy most is these once a week we get together on a Schmooze Day, and I introduce people who probably don't know each other and don't know whether they have anything in common or at all, except I think they're nice people and they should like each other, and they always do. And they always find something to talk about, and we very quickly get right down to it. So today I have two people who are both professors of social science, let's say. In Orlando, Florida, there's Maria Puerto Riera, who teaches at a place called Valencia College. And I think you also teach something remotely in Puerto Rico or something.
Oh, yes, you're right. I also teach at a Puerto Rican university. Thank you.
Terrific. Okay, and here in Toronto is Thomas Ponaya. So say hello, Thomas.
Hello.
Thomas. Yes, Thomas teaches at George Brown College, which is one of the excellent colleges around Toronto. And in the summertime, he teaches at Harvard. They both have, well, I discovered that they are both interested in Venezuela because Maria was originally from Venezuela, and Thomas edited a book about Venezuela, but he says that was 10 years ago, and we're all worried about democracy. So Maria, you were in the middle of something when I interrupted you to say we have to go live. Now, why don't you start over and brief the world about what you've been asked to do and why it's important?
Yes, thank you, Meta. Thomas started the conversation about his interest in progressive movements, social movements, and also where the left is. I think we've talked about this before, Meta. I am really, truly concerned about the increasing relevance of the far extreme right movements. And as a Venezuelan, you would think I would be always looking into situations trying to find communism or socialism. I don't really think that fear mongering is going to work, at least with people like myself, who understand that some of the most anti-democratic regimes that we have in Latin America are not necessarily socialists or communists. They're probably just authoritarians or very close to totalitarian. Mm-hmm. So the problem is here in the US, those of us who have that background coming from countries where socialism was an issue, we find ourselves here kind of being pushed to support these extreme views on the right just because they are an ally against the socialist threat in Latin America. And that's concerning because that's all feeding the de-democratization that we started mentioning. So I know Thomas has a lot to say about that, but in my case, that is very concerning because it's not just the fear mongering. It's the whole narrative that's being built on lies, basically falsehoods that don't really help to get our countries, in Latin America, and it's not helping here in the US either.
I'll just make one point on Venezuela that I think is relevant. When Chavez came in 1998, there was, of course, tremendous optimism around Chavez. And of course, when he survived the coup a few years later, again, there was a lot of optimism around Chavez. And so in my book, I co-edited a book, and the book is called The Revolution in Venezuela. And the what was very clear was in that first decade, Chavez was very successful at reducing extreme poverty, reducing unemployment, and so on. And there's so many interesting social experiments that they tried and so on. The argument that the book made, though, was that if you studied what Chavez was doing internally within his cabinet and so on, he was continuously changing cabinet members more than any other Venezuelan government had done before, like every year, changing positions and so on. And the end result of that was all the vast majority of the information was centralized in Chavez's hands. And so in the conclusion to the book, I pointed out that if something happens to Chavez, this whole project will collapse. Whatever of course, any project has a mixture of impulses, right? Progressive and conservative impulses. But whatever progressive impulses are here, this is going into danger if something happens to Chavez, because so much information is located in his hands. And sure enough, that's what happened. I mean, there is a massive shift after Chavez in terms of, on so many levels, in terms of governance and so on. And, and some, of course, rightly have pointed out the seeds of all this were already there with Chavez, which is, is obviously that's, to some degree true. So that's all I would say with Venezuela. Initially, Chavez pushed the idea of participatory democracy, and there were a lot of interesting experiments around this, but it didn't continue. And so what we saw in Venezuela, a very familiar pattern that we've seen in the past with any kind of revolutionary left government, there's a moment when it can turn into its exact opposite and become quite autocratic. So it's not a new experience, but it was very disheartening to see this really accelerate over the last 10 years in Venezuela. And that's probably part of the reason I just have not put a lot of energy. I'm aware of it, but not put a lot of energy into studying it and so on. Anyways, but at the time, it was a very interesting case study in terms of a wave of progressive governments in Latin America attempting to make transformations, to make substantial social transformations. Interestingly, the country that at the end of the process, I mean, not the end, but at this point in the process, if you look at it over the last 20 years, the country that actually has shown really interesting improvements has been Bolivia, which also was part of that left tide at the time, right? So it's Bolivia that's actually been the one that's been the most impressive. So I often look back and think, oh, if only you had also done some research on Bolivia at the time, that would have been really fantastic to have followed it through. But Venezuela was the exciting one at the time, that initially, right? Then, as I said, it began to follow a pattern we've seen before with revolutionary governments.
I think Thomas is making an important point when he mentions participatory democracy, because one of the goods that Chavez and Chavismo promised was not only participatory democracy as a principle or a model, but also as a practical instrument. And he promoted the communal councils as the start. I'm familiar with it because I started my research on communal councils way back at the beginning. And precisely the problem was not just that Chavez had the information. He centralized the process. It was not a bottom-up process. It was a top-down process. He controlled most of it. And it was completely tied to the party, to the, his political party. So the problem is it wasn't a social movement. It was a social movement controlled by those in power. That's why after he died, it kind of crumbled, because it was seen as a process that had very little of a social movement, because it was very much intertwined with allocating resources, distributing goods. So you can't conceive that in a way that people identify with it beyond, what's in there for me. And that happened very soon. Also, there's another thing. I had students who participated in communal councils, and we would gather and check. One of the problems they faced was that they had to be very much part of the party. So it kind of became a product that you would identify not with the people, but with power. And that's part of the reason why, people just lose faith on those institutions or instruments that you kind of feel they were created for purpose, but they didn't satisfy that purpose at the end. So it's pretty much what you say.
No, I agree completely with Maria. I think this is exactly right. I mean, it became clientelism, a form of clientelism.
Absolutely.
That's the problem.
And
now,
we had that. And we had that in Venezuela.
Yeah.
I mean, we all lived that.
Not only in Venezuela, but the thing is that, what's interesting is at that time, in the early 2000s, the development project that was exciting everyone on the global left was the participatory budget of Porto Alegre. Because the Porto Alegre, starting from 1989, implemented a participatory budget process. So at its height, I think around 2002, it had 17,000 people in the public participating in constructing this budget. So everyone thought this is the way to go. Porto Alegre is a city of 1 million people. The participatory budget process has brought a lot of poor people, a lot of women, a lot of ethnic minorities into actually consulting about the budget. And I think they were consulting on over $100 million in terms of allocating that budget amount, that number. So it's very exciting that Porto Alegre was doing this every year. And even when the government changed, it was, of course, initially set up by the PT, the Workers' Party of But even when the government changed, the new government also continued with the participatory budget because the public wanted it, because it was a bottom-up process. So with this in mind, in the early 2000s, people on the left had these visions of a participatory democratic society. And then when Chavez and Correa and Morales came in Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, of course, they also pushed this rhetoric or discourse of participatory democracy. And so the danger, of course, always was that it would become, as Maria pointed out in Venezuela, it would become clientelism, just a way of garnering votes, right? And not really substantially transforming society. That was always the danger.
I've heard about this experiment that came out of Puerto, whatever.
Porto Alegre.
About having the public write the budget, but I've never read how they did it. Just how in the world would you even go about such a thing? And did it? Obviously, it must have worked at least a while. Is anybody still doing it?
They suspended it recently, in the last couple of years, but that's after doing it for about 30 years. So it's a very successsul project.
Well, how did they do it? I mean, how would you get people to agree on what their priorities to be?
Well, there's a certain amount of money, like I said, over $100 million that was allocated to the, I believe it was that much. I hope I'm not wrong on the number, but it was allocated to the budget process, to the participatory process. So the public would be able to deliberate on how to spend that money. And how they did it is the city was broken up into 16 areas. And so in terms of mayoral elections, you would get 2 representatives from each area. So you would have 32 city councilors. But then they would elect another 32. But these 32 would be elected in popular assemblies. And it would be just people from the public. That second 32 would be given a 2-month course on municipal budgeting and finance. And then the 2 groups of 32 would come together and discuss out the priorities of the budget. So it was a very interesting process, which was trying to break away from just a minister of finance determining priorities.
But it's still a matter of electing deputies to think for you. I was thinking that maybe you got assemblies together and just had people take the mic or something.
You did. But then out of the assembly, they would pick a representative or 2 to represent what had been said at the assembly.
So out of
From
this
the point of the
meeting, at
public.
the end of the meeting, they decide
Okay.
which policies they liked or which proposals
Priorities.
they liked,
Yeah.
priorities.
Yeah.
And that's when they would choose, but not before, right?
Right,
And you had
right.
to be at the assembly to do it.
Yes, as far as yes, that's as much as I know of it.
But you would need activists to participate in these meetings. And
Yeah.
that's how important these movements are. If you don't have the activists, who do you think is going to show up? Political parties and politicians. So that's a problem.
Yeah.
I wonder, Maria, I'm playing with this now because this is such an interesting idea. How could you scale it up? I mean, could you do it by Zoom? Could you say we will on a certain day, the first 100 people who sign into my Zoom account will be the assembly, and we will have a conversation. At the end, we'll pick somebody to represent us at some other higher level meeting. Has anybody thought about doing such a thing?
I mean, Giovanni Sartori in his book, Videocracy, I don't know if you had a chance to look at it.
I haven't heard of it even. What is it?
Videocracy, like
who's he?
Giovanni Sartori, political
Sartori?
scientist, Italian.
Okay.
Giovanni Sartori.
All right.
He used to teach at Columbia.
All right.
He passed away. And he was, we've always tried to figure out before the pandemic, how can we use technology to kind of create a new version of direct democracy? Because participatory democracy is not direct democracy. It's just giving people an opportunity to participate and have a say. And I think that's I don't know, that's been the challenge for participatory democracy. And also, besides Porto Alegre, there was Curitiba, another experience of local government. Brazil has had a lot to show in terms of local government. In Venezuela, we tried to do something. And I remember one of my papers was about the use of resources by communal councils. And the findings were very worrisome because you give people power. You give them rules. You give them resources, because that's part of the issue. Chavez, at the beginning, there were so many resources that he showered these councils with lots and lots of resources, and people in very limited resource communities all of a sudden had so much, but they lacked of how do we improve our communities? What do we need? How do we distribute these resources? One of the things that the government found was that they couldn't audit the communal councils in most cases. Yeah. It was impossible. So what they did was track the expenses and the disbursements. And we found things so unbelievable, communal council presidents buying, SUVs, things like that. And the problem was that communities were still facing problems with lack of running water, like for decades. That was one of the main problems we had in not only poor communities. I lived in a middle class neighborhood, and I spent 13 years in that place without running water. I had to buy a tank. I had to buy it was the little things, access to healthcare. Okay, we had Barrio Dentro. That wasn't enough. We had to keep pushing. But I think the idea was always attractive. The problem was that not everybody was participating. And the problem we always had in Venezuela, which was corruption. So it was kind of a combination that I think
You're breaking my heart, because you're ratifying and confirming my worst concerns. My worst concerns is that when you have a real democracy, the voters are stupid. And what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, well, I'm in the US right now, and I'm, yeah.
Well, the thing is, I think the thing has to do with, it makes sense. First of all, when you say it's breaking your heart, of course, it's depressing to see the different failures we've had with progressive projects, right? But on the other hand, what's interesting is progressive projects are always emerging. That it doesn't actually discourage people. People come back. It might discourage one group, but it doesn't discourage lots of other groups. They come back with new ideas and try to improve on what happened.
But when they do things that are absolutely fatal, they make mistakes. Okay, if you make a trivial mistake, it's a trivial mistake for the head of the organization to buy an SUV for himself. We can live through that. But if you don't put in changes about climate change, or if you don't keep your voting rights, and fatal things, this is fatal. This is the end of civilization. And that's what worries me. It's democracy that's doing it.
Well, go on, Maria. Yeah.
No, I just wanted to share like an example of it. I mean, if you are a progressive, leader and you believe in these ideas, what we're witnessing in Venezuela with, the harm that's being done to the environment because of mining activities that are state sponsored. So where is that, spirit principled, that's why some of us are so, we don't believe.
Say, for example, we look at the left in North America over the last 40 years. I think actually the last time we spoke about this topic. It's very interesting. So on one hand, you could say, well, look how weak the left has been in terms of the great projects around economic redistribution, economic equality. We haven't been successful. We've been very weak in the last 40 years. Inequality's increased. The public isn't convinced of our various forms of redistribution. But in the last 40 years, the left in North America hasn't put the majority of its energy into economic redistribution. We've put the majority of our energy into issues around legal and cultural recognition of diversity and identity. And that's where we've been very successful. Yes. In a 40-year period, we've had incredible success in terms of gender, race, sexuality.
Exactly.
When in human history have you seen this kind of transformation in 40 years? This is a massive transformation that's occurring. Exactly. Now, in our personal lives, we experience things and we think, oh, well, I experienced this discriminatory incident, or I saw someone do something sexist, etc., or racist or homophobic or whatever. But the thing is, the context has completely changed around this. So just as a simple example, when I first started teaching at George Brown College, the majority of the administrators were men, the majority of the professors were men, and the majority of the students were men. 25 years later, the majority of the administrators are women, the majority of the professors are women, the majority of students are women. This is a big transformation. Yeah. And this has happened across the board.
I'd be happier if you'd said 50-50.
Well, hopefully in the future, but we'll see. But the thing is now, so for example, now university in North America, university students are 60% women. This is a big shift that has occurred.
But that explains the backlash. Yeah, of course, that's why the white majority, at least in the US, is so enraged. They don't want women leading.
Right.
Hillary Clinton didn't lose because she was bad. She lost because she was a woman.
Well, and you're right. It's white men and white women voted against her. This is
of course, because women can also be misogynist. It's not a man thing.
Right.
And the other thing is that.
But Maria, that doesn't take away from the game.
Of course. The
gains are unbelievable. Of course
not. No. I agree with that.
Look at any period of history. Take a 40-year chunk of history. Where did you get this kind of movement on LGBTQ issues?
But you know what worries me is that,
or on gender, or on diversity. I mean, you just don't. It's not comparable.
I agree with that. But what worries me is that once Roe v. Wade is overturned, because it is, that's going to hurt the LGBTQ community because they're going after same-sex marriage. That's the whole. I mean, it's not just reproductive rights, because it's not abortion, it's reproductive rights. They're
Right.
going after contraception. They're going after same-sex marriage. They want to, it's a complete backlash.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Of course, it's a backlash, but the overall, I mean, there's no doubt about that. I agree with you. But all I'm saying is the overall trend. The point here is that where the left focuses,
I agree.
we actually can be quite successful, as we have been in the last 40 years. Where we don't focus, we didn't focus, say, 40 years ago on de-democratization. We didn't focus over the last 40 years enough on economic equality. And so these are areas we're very weak on, but we did focus on cultural equality. And that's where we've seen big movements.
I think that what we need to, picking it up from where you left it, we can't be a single issue, spectator, like, yeah, I'm just going to focus on, because that also feeds the idea that you are okay, you accept inequality, economic, social inequality, you're okay with that because you're focusing on other social issues. And I think that's a problem, not only among progressives. I think it's in general for those of us who believe in democracy as a form, not of government, a way of living, as a social construct. If we don't speak up, I mean, the obscene amount of money billionaires have made during the pandemic, and we are still listening to these people, look down on those who have kept us fed during the pandemic, which are minorities, which are women, and that they have not gone back to work because they don't have access to childcare, to, VPK. And it's being allowed, and we are, I don't know, I just feel like it's up to us, those of us who feel like this is wrong. It's not because I envy a billionaire. I don't want to travel to Mars. I don't care about that. I would just, I would feel satisfied. They just pay their fair share of taxes. I pay taxes. I pay a lot in taxes. Why can't they pay what they should?
Yeah.
Just to see this guy from Tesla speak about, the Build Back Better or whatever piece of legislation as, like
Maria,
he did.
Everything that these rich guys do that fits what you're saying is understandable, predictable in terms of material interest. You say,
of course,
all, these rich guys, in fact, they aren't all that way. I mean, you do find somebody like Warren Buffett saying, take my money. I should, but the problem isn't those guys. The problem is guys like Manchin, who just screwed up the whole effort to.
But Meta, we knew he was going to do it.
Listen to me. Why the hell do these people in West Virginia elect somebody like that when they are the ones who need the money? They need the healthcare, they need the environment, they need all of these things that you're talking about. But they go along, they're the ones supporting the stupid policies.
Of course, but they're not going to elect a Democrat. They're going to elect a guy like him who's not a Republican, but acts like one.
That's the problem.
That's West Virginia. That's West Virginia.
But you're
not going to get a Democrat from there. The closest thing you're going to get to a Democrat in West Virginia is Joe Manchin.
That's my question.
And we knew this was going to happen.
But Maria, you're not answering my question. You're saying exactly what I'm saying, that yes, these stupid people will vote for the worst against their own interests.
I have a theory. When you have an uneducated constituency who does not have the information to make better choices, because take a look at what's happening in schools around the US. They're banning books. Right now, I'm in Florida. There's a law that prohibits us to teach anything that has to do with race. There's a law that allows students to videotape us if they believe that we are indoctrinating them. This is happening. So that's the kind of people that vote for that kind of politician. They don't have the information. If we're not allowed to educate people, they are going to continue to make these choices.
I looked at the polls, the exit polls from this last election, the last election.
The 2020.
It's very, very, very slightly, almost no correlation with education and almost no correlation with income, except at the top level. When you get above $100,000 a year, and you're talking about professionally trained people who are in the, the IT and professionals, those people have a different politics. But anything below that, and we're talking about college graduates, anything below that, there's almost no correlation with education. So,
but West Virginia is different. West Virginia is a very poor state. It's different.
No.
It's it's a coal mining state.
Can I just point out something here that you might find might be helpful? Well, first of all, as you pointed out, Maria's absolutely right in the sense of in West Virginia, they tend to vote Republican. So Manchin was a conservative Democrat who was elected. But one thing to remember, just try not to forget this, because I too I read that article about Manchin this morning and I was really angry. And because it's just obvious what he had been doing all along.
Of course.
He was taking it. And by the way, Joe Lieberman did this in the past with Obama. This is not a new thing, right?
Yeah.
But one thing to try to remember is Manchin has proposed for Build Back Better a $1.5 trillion deal. This is further to the left than Barack Obama in 2008. Try to remember that. Barack Obama proposed $874 billion. Manchin has proposed more than Barack Obama. This tells us something, that the spectrum has shifted in the Democratic Party. It has moved further to the left. I wouldn't forget that point, right? So Manchin's actions are predictable. If he wants to be reelected in West Virginia, he was going to do.
He has to do this.
This is predictable. I'm not justifying it. I don't think it's right. I wish he was principled, et cetera, but we know how politicians always disappoint because they follow their own interest. They follow their electoral interest. But
there's this.
No, that's let me finish. The second thing here is parties are an amalgam of policies. So when people vote for a party, especially in the US, with the Democrats and the Republicans, they're voting, they may not want to vote against their economic interests, but they're voting for what they perceive as their cultural interest or their identity.
Yes.
Right? So there's often contradictions.
Absolutely.
There, right?
Absolutely.
So that's also something to remember. And then the third thing I would just point out is the media system in the US is tailored almost to skewing the views of the population. I mean, there's no comparison. In Canada, Fox News, no one's going to watch Fox News. It's not persuasive in Canada. Canadians are the most, and this is where education is important. Canadians are the most educated group in the world in terms of percentage that have a college diploma and university degree. Canadians are the most educated group in the OECD countries. And they tried Fox News here, Fox North, and no one would watch it because Canadians don't take this stuff seriously. So this is also important. The media strategy, and this is, I would say this is where the left has been weak. The online world is free, but the left did not come up with a successful media strategy to combat this stuff, a coherent, cohesive strategy. Whereas the right,
it's really bad.
Fox News and that have come up with an incredible strategy. Their ability to say critical race theory and this have massive implications all over the country, and to completely skew what this means is just very impressive how they do things, right? And the left hasn't had, or even liberals for that matter, haven't had a comparable media strategy, right? Which is strange because the left technically, at least quantitatively, is more educated.
Okay, if you were writing,
I think that's a problem.
Media strategy, man, here's your chance. Tell me what it would look like that we should have. Assuming, if you will, that I'm left, which some days I'm not sure what I am. Go ahead.
I wanted to just piggyback on what Thomas said. um, going back to Manchin. Manchin is playing his cards for his 2024 reelection. The problem is that last night, the Union of Coal Miners, they asked him to rethink his position on Build Back Better. That was astonishing. Coming from that union. So the shift that Thomas is talking about, I think it is something, I'm not sure completely, but there's something there, because I wouldn't have expected that bill. And you know what they say? They are thinking that coal is over, and they want a chance to re-educate themselves, retrain themselves for this clean energy that's coming. They know it's coming. The problem is Manchin is receiving money. Donors are on that side. And don't get me started about the insulin. I don't want to get there, but that's the problem. The dark money in US politics, it's killing this democracy.
Yeah.
That's the problem, because when you have Rupert Murdoch, but then you have the Koch brothers, and you have the Mercers, and you have all those people funding media. We need like a Warren Buffett to fund something to go against Fox. We don't have that. So it's a biased media, but also we have a very mediocre mainstream media. The both sidism is also contributing to kill this democracy, because they are legitimizing, normalizing practices that are against them. I always say, you guys are doing something that media in Venezuela did, and Chavez killed them. You're going to get killed. You're going to be erased if you don't really try and look at what you're doing. Today, Newsweek published a piece about, 17 million Trump supporters are going to show up in 2024 and kill everybody. That's not what it says, but you get the picture. Because if Trump isn't recognized as the winner, what election? He's not even running. We don't know if he's going to run. So they are creating this narrative. With what purpose? They think it's just the money, but they're destroying this democracy from the basics.
Well,
So
I mean, if they are warning us that things may get even worse than now, and they may be right. And when somebody warns you, I don't take it as necessarily an evil thing for them to remind me that I'm going into I'm not doing the things that I need to be doing. So I'm not sure that it's just evil money that's making Newsweek or whatever outfit you're. I read the same thing in Foreign Affairs last night, same message, so it isn't just money that's telling us, watch out, look what's coming, because it may be exactly what's coming.
Meta also, who are the owners of those media outlets? It's not just Fox with Murdoch. Take a look at who bought Politico and who bought Newsweek. I mean, it's not just US dark money. This is global. It's happening in Hungary, in Poland. I mean, it's not the US. That's what people think. Oh, the US. It's not the US.
No, I know that. And it's certainly, that's the worst of it, is absolutely worldwide. We have the rise of authoritarianism. And okay, I'm interrupting. Go on, Thomas. Your turn.
No, I mean, I didn't really have enough. I mean, in terms of your idea of a media strategy, I mean, I think the thing is, again, just look at the last 30 or 40 years. Anyone who was in university was dealing with, say you were, for example, a grad student, you were receiving tons of information. If you're in the humanities and social sciences, so many articles around race, gender, sexuality, endless debates around these things, et cetera, et cetera. That energy that went into those issues previously went into issues around economic redistribution and so on, say in the 60s and 70s and so on. In the future, it'll be something else. And so maybe media should be one of those things that we pour our energy into, intellectual and activist energy. So I mean, I see it more as a question of choice. What are our priorities? It's become very clear. The media is a huge player. And as Maria pointed out, the right is mobilized around this. They know The most important thing, one of the most important things you do when you become successful is you buy the Washington Post. You buy something important, and that way you protect yourself.
You could do worse than buying the Washington Post, man. And what they're saying, I'm not sure how much I would change it if I were editor of the Washington Post.
Right. Well, anyways, all I'm saying is this is where energy has to go into a whole media strategy, a whole conception. But it's very clear the media no longer is representing the experience of half the population. The mainstream media doesn't represent the experience of half the population.
You are absolutely right.
So, I mean, you have to have then an alternative media. And social media has been an attempt at it, but because it's not systematic, then it goes off in directions that are based on hearsay. My friend Karen on Facebook told me this, right? So, I mean, this is not the way you want to go, but you need a systematic strategy around it. But there's certainly the resources and capacity to do this. But again, it's priorities. What do progressives prioritize? You prioritize culture, you get advances in culture. You deprioritize economics, then you get beaten on economics. I mean, this is the thing. I mean, now where we can have some optimism, I think, is one of the most popular politicians in the US, maybe the most popular and the most hated, is AOC. And part of the reason is because she bridges the cultural and the economic. Yeah. She's a socialist who pushes on race, gender, sexuality, and she also adds the environmental thing, right? Which she understands as a key issue of the future and of the present. So, I mean, there's space for optimism, but I think progressives have to be very clear on what's the key issue here to deal with. And it's obvious, I think, for all of us over the last 40 years, that the media is crucial. That has to be an issue we pour energy into.
You know what I liked? I did think this morning I read Bernie Sanders commenting on Manchin, saying, he voted not only for a military budget that was 4 times, I think he said, it's hard to believe,
880 billion.
4 times the size of the Build Back Better. Is that possible?
And yes, because it was 880 a year.
Not only this huge amount of money for more than practically all the rest of the world put together, but also they added $25 billion to it, that more than had been requested by Biden or something. Look, I only read this sort of going past it and thinking, that can't be right. Now tell me, is this right? I mean, there's where, if you want a strategy, let's convert the military to something that actually helps people.
And here's the thing. You read it as 880 billion a year, but when you read the Build Back Better is 1.8 trillion. The way media frames it, why doesn't media use the 4 trillion something that the defense budget is getting?
Yeah. Okay, they don't. If you took your trillions and divided it up by year, how much is that compared to the military?
I think it would be less, because it's less than half.
4 times as much.
Less than half. The Build Back was they were between 1.5, 1.8 trillion.
For 10 years.
I mean, it's less than half. That's the other part. They don't say it's
4
10
times.
Years.
He said the military is 4 times. If I'm not mistaken, I don't have it here. But
I'm gonna look for Bernie's tweet. But that's my complaint with media. Who are they playing for? Because that's not helping people. That's not being accurate. You're not reporting because you have different standards. That's the problem. And that's why I think they are part of the problem. They are not the solution.
Yeah, but now let's go back to what the assignment I gave Thomas, to rewrite the strategy for the left. And Thomas has said, stop focusing on culture, which I agree with.
No, I didn't say stop. I'm just saying this, be clear on what the priority is.
And economics, okay. I agree economics is relevant, but I would say shift from military emphasis or just take it for granted. I mean, military budget is sacred. You can't mess with that. But shift from even accepting the military budget to transferring that budget into climate change, because there's where we need all kinds of things, and it's such an emergency.
Yeah.
That's my
you're right. You're right. You know what's interesting actually right now on YouTube, what's interesting is that there are lots of numerous shows like yours here, Meta. It's very interesting. There are numerous shows in which people talk completely outside of the media framework around issues, both on the right and on the left. And this I find kind of interesting. So it's a recognition that the public is actually hungry for knowledge, but the mainstream media is giving a kind of warped or partial view of what's actually going on. So there's actually lots of shows emerging with lots of very interesting analysis of what's going on in our world. And it's accessible. This is interesting. Now, the only thing is it's not systematic in terms of from the progressive point of view. What's the issue we want to push forward, and let's all move forward on that issue. It's not systematic. That's our challenge right now. But there is a concern and an awareness. You can see that emerging just very recently, actually. So many intellectuals and educators and so on, and activists going out and putting really fascinating stuff, fantastic stuff online. So, for example, one of my favorite organizations is Progressive International, which is a kind of uniting progressives around the world. Bernie Sanders and Yanis Varoufakis were the founders of it. They regularly put out really amazing stuff on YouTube, like debates between intellectuals around some of the big issues that concern us. And this is just there for anyone to watch. I mean, it's fantastic. So I think, again, there's seeds of possibility here. Will it be developed? Well, that we have to see. That's up to us, right? But there are seeds of possibility.
I think media has a role to play in politics. I'm not the kind of, I don't think we have to ignore the power and the importance of having media in politics. The problem is when they play the role of a political actor instead of being an instrument for people to make informed decisions. That's a problem. I do agree that the left has been, I think it's a little bit of, the left thinks that you can do it without them, that you don't need media because you have alternative media, social media, you have YouTube. The problem is that you are leaving a void and it's being filled with all these far right, extreme right voices.
Yeah.
And that's what people are listening to.
Yeah.
I have friends on the left who will only exclusively listen to YouTube programs and read, because of my job, I have to read all sides. But I've been, I've been concerned about what my students are reading. For example, I had them work this year with Tim Snyder's essay, The Avis. I thought it was an important piece they had to read. And I had a student tell me that they had to write an essay in response to that essay. And the student said, you know what, this is all fake news. This is not something that's worth my time reading. This is a complete lie. Where do they get that from? They get it from Fox, they get it from Newsmax, they get it from all these outlets. But the problem is that when mainstream media like Washington Post and New York Times do not clarify that these are falsehoods, people might think that they are legitimate, interpretations, opinions, because everybody has an opinion. So because it's your opinion, that's good enough. I'm trying to get my students this next semester to listen to podcasts. I think I have to look for some, other resources where they can get a fair assessment of what's going on. I'm not pretending to be unbiased, but I do want them to listen to and have access to pieces of information that can help them understand what's going on. Because right now, the problem is that this democracy is really in danger. It's not, this is a real alarm. So I guess we have to look for ways to help at least those of us in higher education. We need to give them an opportunity to see the light because media is not helping.
I'd like to I wish it were possible to compare your students to Thomas's students. I don't know, what kind of students are you having, Thomas? And are you facing anything like what she's described? People who believe that ordinary reportage of facts consist of fake news. I don't see, I mean, I don't go outside my apartment, so I have no idea what goes on in the world, except the people that I happen to bump into on my screen. So I don't know, but I would imagine that your students are not altogether like Maria's students. What do you think?
Well, it depends which students you're talking about. My Harvard students or my George Brown students?
Both,
A very different group, right?
sure, of course.
And the George Brown students are from a very different group as well. But I mean, I did find the George Brown students, one thing, or the college students in general, they're engaged in employment programs. Like they come into programs in order to get jobs. They're not coming in as in a kind of liberal arts, I want to expand my mind, or I'm taking this course because it sounded interesting to study globalization or whatever. It's not necessarily that. That might be part of it, but the driving force for sure is to get a job, which makes sense. I mean, that's what how the college advertises itself, and that's why they're there. And so those students, it is true, they do drink in the mainstream media narrative. The Canadian was George Brown is in Canada, so and in Toronto, so it's the mainstream Toronto narrative that they're taking in. So it was one of the interesting things was over the last couple of years, quite a lot of them would ask me, well, what do you think of Jordan Peterson? I really like him because, of course, he's the University of Toronto professor. He's a conservative professor. He's a thoughtful professor, but he's a conservative professor, they really like him, and he knows how to speak to them. So and the media has pushed him forward. The conservative media certainly has pushed him forward.
Of course.
So the students, a lot of them were reading his book, right? 12
I wouldn't criticize him too much for that. I think he's got a lot, that's really good. So I would say 70% I like him, and another few percentage I'm not so sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but my point was simply that the students do listen to mainstream media, and they are influenced by it. And conservative media in Canada does have huge influence. I mean, most of our media is conservative, right, in Canada, but it's not the conservatism of the U.S. It's not that. It's not radically conservative, right?
It's not extreme.
Conservative, yeah, it's not that extreme, but it is kind of conservative, and that does appeal to them. So.
Right.
I mean, that's a whole other discussion, though, in terms of what the students, what their needs are today, their own personal needs, which I think are quite different from the previous generation students. Very, very different.
Now tell us about your Harvard students, your summer Harvard students who are not the winter Harvard students, right?
Right. Well, some are. There's some overlap, but the summer Harvard students, I think, in general, I mean, the majority of them, the vast majority of them, are going to be Democrats. Right. So this has been one of the weird patterns. In the past, the educated tended to vote to the right and the working class voted to the left. And of course, that has reversed today. Yes. Today, the educated tend to vote to the left and the working class tend to vote to the right. So the Harvard students, perhaps following that, the majority of them, at least the summer ones, seem to me to be Democrats, at least when we talk about policy, economic policy, and so on, right? And cultural policy. So, yeah. So I don't think they're watching Fox News, but I would leave it at that. Right?
No, go back and now compare your Harvard students to your work. Are you saying they're mostly working class students here, and that you teach
George Brown?
At George Brown?
Yeah, I mean, here I don't think many of them have parents who've gone to university. Very few of them.
Very
few of them.
First generation. College students.
Yeah. The vast majority are first generation college students. I remember one student saying to me, "Oh, my parents are highly educated," and I said, "Oh, well, what do you mean by that?" And she said, "Oh, well, they have they have bachelor's degrees," and so that's like the difference. Of course, if an Ivy League student said to you, "My parents are highly educated," that would mean they're professors, PhD. Doctors or lawyers or whatever, right? But so it's different. It's a different perspective, right? Coming at it from the student who has low educational capital. versus the student who's emerging out of high educational capital, right?
Okay, now you say that your local students, your Toronto students, are conservative because they're.
No, I didn't say they're conservative. I said they're open to a certain conservative message. Like, for example, Peterson, a lot of them would read Peterson, and Peterson's always aligned himself with conservative party. And my students, it's probably not in their economic interest to support the conservative party,
Right.
but they won't necessarily understand that or see that.
But you say that they absorb the Toronto or the Canadian media, mainstream media. Well, the mainstream, I take the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star, and they're certainly not pro-Trump types of conservatives. Right. There's nobody in Canada that I know of that would be like a Trump politics or economic policy, right?
Well, they are pro, but they are pro. They are pro John Tory, the Globe and Mail, right, or the conservative papers in Canada. John Tory is our mayor in Toronto. He's a kind of moderate conservative. So they're pro him, right? And they haven't been strongly against Doug Ford. They're not absolutely. The Toronto Star would be, but not the Globe and Mail. So they're not strongly against Doug Ford because he's a kind of conservative they can live with. So no, but the Trump thing, that's an extreme case in the U.S. But the U.S., see the difference with the U.S. and Canada. I mean, the obvious example is the U.S. is much more extreme on the left and on the right. It's much more extreme because the situation is much more extreme. In Canada, we have a kind of, it's not social democracy, but we have quite a lot of safety nets underneath people. The education is much more affordable, all the healthcare and so on. All these things protect people. They prevent them from going.
Canadians live 3 years longer on the average than Americans. Now, that's all you need to say is guys down south, you're doing something wrong if you're dying 3 years earlier. Right.
On so many different stats. Yeah. But I mean, there's lots of reasons for that. But so I would see that as a difference with Canada and the US in terms of the extremism of the politics.
Yeah.
But that's, in a way, that's because the US requires drastic change. So it's understandable that the right is extreme and the left is extreme. The problem is so profound that you need something really substantial to change it. And if a president comes along like Trump, and he sounds like you and talks like you and has your cultural interests, then he sounds like he's going to try to help you. That's how the public interprets it. Right.
Okay. Well, this is a depressing conclusion. And can anybody think of anything upbeat to say before we say goodbye?
No, I mean, I don't think it's depressing. I think it's, as I said before, we move forward depending on what we focus on and what we put energy into. We have moved tremendously over the last 40 years. There's a backlash because we have moved more rapidly than any other 40-year period of history when it comes to issues of cultural diversity. But I mean, that's our success, right? So our story among progressives is a story of defeat and victory. I wouldn't just make it a story of defeat. Okay. That's not interpreting what's actually all the complexities. I had a professor, a colleague, who said to me recently, actually, he's in his 70s, and he's a great professor and a great person. He said to me, things were so much better in the 1960s. And I said, for who? And he said, oh, well, it was just, the economy. And I said, but for who? Not for women. And I said, not for people of color. So for who? Who was it better? I mean, and to not see that, what a transformation we've had. And is, I think, just focusing too much on one side of the equation, not focusing on the other side, where we have focused and where we have moved forward on.
I will take that as the most upbeat thing I'm going to get out of you guys. It's been great fun, not enjoyable altogether, considering the topic, but nevertheless, really worthwhile. And I hope you have a great holiday season, both of you.
You too, Meta. You too.
Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week, sometimes more. And this is episode 388. You can watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we post the transcripts there too. When you get to the website, please look around because we have conversations going on all the time about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. After you've watched or listened to it, scroll down and share your thoughts about the show with the other viewers. This is a place for dialogue, so please join in. See you there.